This is a garden room, a garden studio, a backyard office, a she shed, a man cave, or as I like to call it, an anything space. I'm gonna show you everything I've learned from building 6 of these, as well as my degree in architectural engineering, and give you the complete tutorial on how you can build one of these yourself or hire somebody else to build it for you. I'm gonna show you the 12 steps that I take to construct one of these, and I'm also gonna give you the complete plans for this design, the common cave, which are available on my website at backyardarchitect.com/cave. They're not too hard to build. I know, because I've now built 6. The first one was actually a backyard bar, but had a portion in the back that acted like a shed. Next was an office, which remains to be one of my favorite designs that I've made. Then a garden studio, another office with a shed, and finally, another office.
The first 2 steps are in the design stage. It's here where we'll be deciding what you'll be building, as well as where you'll be building it. Say that 10 times fast. In step 3, we build a frost-proof, insulated foundation that's resistant to critters getting underneath it. Next up is framing. This is where you chop wood like a black belt and realize the overall structure of your anything space. After framing, we need to weatherproof it. This is where we keep the air in and the water out. Step 6 is where I show you how to install the windows and the doors. I do it in a way that works with just about any window or door, and I also show you how to source high quality windows and doors for cheap. Step 7 is where we wrap our building in a sweater. This is the first step in insulating it. Next up is exterior finishes. And this is where we put a raincoat on top of our sweater to protect it and make it look pretty. Following this, we give this thing some power by hooking it up to your house's main electrical panel. This is also where we install an HVAC system, giving it heating and cooling. In step 10, we finish insulating it by adding a bunch of pink fluffy stuff to the structure. With the space nice and warm, we make it livable by adding drywall and flooring. And finally, we complete the build with those finishing touches that bring it from good to great. You can find each step in the timeline below. I'm going to share all of this with you so that you get an understanding of how we've been building homes up till today. Once you're nice and caught up to speed, I'll then share with you what's next for home construction. Let's begin with step 1.
This office is for a woman named Shar, and Shar is a psychotherapist, meaning that the design had to support both remote as well as in-person work. So there's this way about thinking about spaces in architecture that I really like, where spaces are either a common or a cave. Common being like a living room, a kitchen, and a cave being like a office or a bedroom. And we were trying to strike a middle ground with this because it's gotta feel like a cave where you feel safe and secluded, while at the same time, you're having one-on-ones in here. And so really it is a shared space. It's a common cave. So that's what I ended up calling it. It's called the common cave. I like it.
So how do we come up with the design? We started by identifying its purpose. Shar wanted to have an office space separate from her home where she could have one-on-ones with clients both virtually and in person. Knowing this, we were able to come up with the design requirements. She would be using it year-round, so it would have to be insulated and have a heating and cooling system. Since we landed on adding a mini split for heating and cooling, an electrical hookup to the house's main panel would be required. Meetings would require an isolated space, so the shell of the building had to be closed off from the external environment. She decided that for breaks, she would go back into her home, so plumbing wasn't a requirement. Given our size and location, that meant that we wouldn't need a building permit for this project. And lastly, she wanted a professional look and feel to her office, so we made sure that it had a fully finished interior. With the design requirements defined, the rest of the office was discovered by looking at the site itself. Based on Shar's backyard, there was really only one obvious location for the office, which is fine. I mean, creativity needs constraints. Knowing that her office was going to be placed here gave context to the window and door placement. We knew that her desk was going to be placed along that north wall, and she wanted natural light on her desk, but didn't want to be on display for her neighbors at the same time. So we placed a high window along that west wall. In Canada, where this office is located, southern facades get the most sun. We wanted this place to feel cozy, safe, and pleasant, and we felt that an abundance of natural light would help accomplish that. So we put double glass doors along the southern facade that bring that light in, as well as a tall window on the west wall close to those doors, so that we could get some views to the pool and the garden and bring even more light in. for the space. The last thing for us to do in this design stage was to consider the user experience for both Shar as well as her clients as they enter into this office. Shar would be approaching the office from her basement sliding door, and that's on the west side. So as she approaches the office along a concrete path, she'd be able to actually look into the space and is familiarizing herself with her office as she approaches. Her client, on the other hand, they'd be coming from the east side yard. And as they do that, they walk down some stairs and they're not actually greeted by the office until they turn the corner. We didn't want her clients to be approaching the office and thinking, am I in the right space? Is this the right house? So we placed her business's logo along that east wall, as well as a side light to help greet them. As we enter, we wanted to emphasize the transition from an open environment to a closed, intimate space. And we did this by using a cedar entryway. So this cedar entryway contrasts the rest of the office. The rest of the office is this opaque, dark siding that feels like a protective shell on the building, whereas the front is inviting. It opens up to the user and says, come on in. And that entryway is further emphasized with the angled overhang. It mimics the entryway into a den or a cave and punctuates that transition. So that was the idea. I think we achieved it pretty well. And yeah, that's how we came up with the design. So for those first two steps, I've written blog posts that help walk you through that exact same process so that you can come up with your own design for your own backyard and your own specific needs. For these remaining 9 steps of the build, they're all about construction. And as I walk you through them, I'm going to be referencing a plan set that's available for free on my website. It has all the dimensions that you need, a material list, support on how to hire a contractor if you choose to do so, as well as instructions on how to modify it to your own design that you come up with if you choose to do so. It's actually free, and I only ask that in return, if you find this useful, you like, subscribe, and share it with somebody who you think could use it or find it valuable. Okay, let's begin construction with step 3, creating the foundation. So the first part of creating a foundation is the site prep. Here you can see the location that we chose for Shar's office. You approach it from the side yard, going down these steps, around the corner of the office, and then you enter. To create the foundation, we have 6 concrete piers to build. And that's going to take a lot of concrete if you live in Canada, like me, because these concrete piers have to be below the frost line. And where I live in Toronto, that's 4 feet deep. So the first thing that you want to do is, once you've decided on the site, place down some blocks of any kind and get a feel for the perimeter. What is this building going to feel like in your yard? Once you've decided on that, you're actually going to put up some strings to get a more concrete idea of this perimeter. A good way to put up these strings is by doing this knot that you see here, where you go over twice and under once. This allows the knot to be adjustable, which is really useful in this stage. With the perimeter set, you can now measure its diagonals. We want to make sure that we have a perfect rectangle. For this design, it's 8 by 12. Yours might be slightly different. We can know that it's a perfect rectangle by measuring the diagonals and making sure they're the same. Once you've got that perimeter locked in, you can place little sticks or whatever to mark where your piers are going to go. With those marked, you can take them out and begin digging. I used an auger for this step. You can of course use a shovel, but an auger is going to speed things up a lot and save you a lot of back pain, to be honest. Although some is inevitable. With the holes dug, you can use the sonotubes to check their depth. Like I said, in Toronto, that is 4 feet deep, as we want it to be below the frost line, so these sonotubes were 4 feet. Now, with all the sonotubes in place, we can put this string back in, and now we're looking at the string to see if it's level or not. Once we have it level, we want all the strings level with each other. So they have to be at the same points on each of the pegs that you put into the ground. We're trying to create a level plane here, and we're doing that because that's where we're going to raise the sonotubes to that level plane. This allows all the concrete piers to cure at the same height. That's our goal here. It's to get all the sonotubes at the same height. We're going to start off the holes with 3 inches of gravel. This can be 3/4 inch gravel. This sonotube in particular got stuck at a certain point. It hit a rock on the side and wasn't able to go any further, so I just cut it to height. You also might come across some groundwater in this process. That's okay. You definitely should call before you dig so that you don't hit any lines for waters or whatnot, but groundwater is normal, and if you just wait a day, it'll disappear. Now we get to the point where we're actually mixing concrete. I recommend a wheelbarrow for this. You can also rent a concrete mixture, but if you're mixing it by hand like I am, or even in a concrete mixer, you're looking for this consistency. You want to be able to glide your shovel along and create a smooth surface. It's this smoothie-like consistency. Once you have it at that stage, you can begin pouring it into the forms. As you pour, make sure to take some scrap piece of wood and pound the concrete into place. We want to make sure that there are no voids in our concrete piers. As you get to the top, you can use your hand or a board to vibrate the surface and let all of the bubbles rise to the top and dissipate. This allows for a smooth finish on the outside. This is also a good point to sign your work. I like to put my initials or my logo into the concrete piers at this stage. As the concrete piers cure, they're going to go down about an inch or so. You just want to make sure that they're all level with that plane that you created with the strings earlier. Once they're cured, you can remove all the strings and as well as the sonotubes from the surrounding of your concrete piers. I also like to take a hammer and round off the edges for these piers to make sure that water can drain off. Now, for a little bonus, I'm going to show you how to create 2 sawhorses out of 2 12-foot 2x4s. It's really simple. You cut 14 pieces of wood at 32 inches. Once you've cut one, you can use that as a template to just mark all the others. Once you've got all 14 cut, it's pretty simple how you put these together. You're going to create I-beams, basically, out of 3 of them, and do that twice because you're creating 2. And then from there, you take the legs and you screw them into those I-beams, just like I show here. And that's it. 2 really simple stackable sawhorses that are going to come in handy for the rest of the build. So our next step in creating the foundation is the floor frame itself. So we're using pressure treated 2x8s for this floor frame. And even though that this was a 12-foot piece of wood, we're going to make sure to measure it and see that it's actually 12 feet. Sometimes they come a little long. When you have 2 bowed pieces of wood, you want to make sure that they counter each other's bows by placing those opposite to each other. Then you can nail them together. As I nailed them, I made sure one was slightly shorter than the other. This allows us to do a joint like you see here, where you can nail it from both sides. You want to make sure the top of those 2 boards are flush with each other. We're going to further reinforce this joint with corner brackets. Now that we've created the perimeter of the floor frame with doubled pressure treated 2x8s, we're going to make sure that it's perfectly square before we then take 2 pieces of subflooring and screw that to the frame so that we lock it in to that squared off position. Knowing that we've now locked it off at a perfect rectangle, we're going to make sure that it's level. Using our level, we're going to measure that and add composite shims to raise it where we need to. Make sure these are composite shims instead of wooden shims because they have a much better compressive strength. To anchor our frame to the concrete piers, we're going to use galvanized steel L brackets, and we're going to drill pilot holes for Tapcon screws. As you screw in these Tapcon screws, don't use an impact driver like I did here. That will cause too much torque on the screw and cause it to shear. Make sure you use a drill, as that doesn't twist past a certain amount of torque. After that, you can secure those L brackets to the frame. With all the L brackets in place, you can now remove the subflooring and focus on the installation of chicken wire around the perimeter. We're doing this to make sure that no critters can get underneath the office. So dig a small trench around the perimeter and nail in some chicken wire or something similar, bending the bottom at an L away from the garden room. This will make sure that critters can't dig underneath it. With that done, we're moving to install the joists now. And to do this, we're making a mark every 16 inches. On most tape measures, that's going to be a red number. Makes it really easy. To install these joists, we're going to make a little jig. So just take 2 scraps pieces of wood and line up a notch that points right to the center of the wood below it, like you see here. We're also going to put 2 screws in so that their tips are coming out just on the other side so that we can bite into the wood. This is all going to make sense in a second. So we're going to line up that notch in one of those marks that we've made that are 16 inches on center. We're going to press it in so that the screws bite into the wood and hold it in place. This allows us to now take our joist hangers and wrap them around that scrap piece of wood. We can screw them into place, remove the jig, and our joist hangers are going to be in the right spot.
Here, the focus just like slides up to there.
With the joist hangers in place, we can now take our joists and drop them into place. further attach them with some screws. With that done, we're now going to install the rigid insulation into our floor frame. To do this, I've created another jig. The purpose of this jig is so that we can set the blocking at the correct depth. We want to set this blocking exactly 4 inches from the top of the joists, since we're putting in 4 inches of rigid insulation. Once we've installed blocking on both sides, we can then cut the rigid insulation to the correct width and fit it into place. It's going to rest on top of that blocking. It should be a tight squeeze at this stage. We want to limit the amount of airflow that can come up into that cavity. Now, you can use a circular saw to cut the rigid insulation like I did. You can also use a knife. Circular saw is going to be a lot more messy. I would recommend a knife. It's just a lot slower. And just like that, you're done 2 layers of rigid insulation and you have an insulated floor frame. Be sure to walk on the joists at this stage, not the rigid insulation. You'd fall right through. Now we're going to install the subfloor. Because once we install the subfloor, these lines that we've made for the joists are going to disappear. We're going to transfer them onto the sides of our floor frame so that we can see them. We want to make sure our subfloor lands right in the middle on one of the joists. And if you're using tongue and groove OSB like I am, then that will result on one of the edges being slightly off the outer edge. That's okay, that's normal. If you can find floor screws, perfect, use those.
Generally speaking, we want to use screws here instead of nails because they're going to have a lot better gripping strength into the joists.
And that'll make sure that we limit the amount of squeaking that our floor has. As we put our subfloor pieces together, we want to make sure there's a 1/8 inch gap to allow for expansion and contraction from moisture. When you're hammering the outer edge, make sure that you use a piece of scrap wood, not just your bare hammer, as that will damage the edge. And when you're screwing in the inner joints, screw them in on an angle so that you hit those joists. To make sure that we hit the joists that are just in the middle of the subfloor, a chalk line is recommended. This makes things a lot easier. And just like that, you've created a frost-resistant, insulated foundation. Good job. You can celebrate. Nice. Cool. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next step. The foundation's complete, and we can use it as our base to build off of. The next step is wall framing. We're going to frame the build. So just like we did with the floor frame, we're going to mark our top and bottom plates of each wall 16 inches on center. We'll then line up our studs to those lines before we nail them into place. The reason we're using nails and not screws is because the walls of our building, they're gonna shift a little bit over time as they settle and face wind.
The nails are going to shift with the building, whereas screws over time might shear.
For times when your stud is twisted, here's a little trick to pull it into place. You can place a screw in it and then use your hammer as a big lever arm to pull it back into position before you nail it. With all the studs nailed together, we're now going to nail on our sheathing. I used 7/16 OSB. Around the perimeter, we're going to put a nail in every 6 to 8 inches. For all the interior studs, every 8 inches or so is fine. And just like the subfloor, we're going to leave a 1/8 inch gap between pieces of sheathing to allow for expansion and contraction. Before we put up these walls, we're going to make sure that we install their air and water barrier. I use Tyvek home wrap for this. That's something that you can find basically anywhere, and it's quite cheap. Works just fine. We're going to use plastic cap nails to secure it in place, and we only need a few here. There's going to be a lot more stuff on the outside of the wall that will hold this in place, so we can be pretty minimal with the amount of nails that we put at this stage. Along the top and side edges, we're going to leave a flap so that we can tape that to the next wall or the roof section. For the bottom, we can tape that to the OSB itself. And just like that, our wall is ready to be raised. Before you do this, screw a spare stud into the floor frame. This will allow you to hold the wall in position once you've raised it. At this stage, I took a piece of scrap wood and made sure that it was the correct distance from the edge of the floor frame. I then raised that spare stud so that it acted as a brace for the wall. Now before I nailed the wall into place, I had to make sure it was tight up against the floor frame. Pulling it tight with one hand, I was able to then nail it into the floor frame. And specifically, I'm trying to hit the joists with these nails. You can then also nail the sheathing into the floor frame. Then came the next wall, using the same method where I braced it once it was up. Before nailing it, I put a screw in at the bottom, and that was just to hold everything in position. I then went to the back and saw that there was a gap, and so I had to pull that tight before I put in another screw, made sure everything was nice and tight, then put in all the nails. With everything nailed together, nice and tight, I could overlap those flaps and tape them together so that it's a continuous air and water barrier. Next came the framing for a wall with 2 windows in it. So I'm going to show you how to frame a window. You start off by framing it just like a normal wall. At the bottom of the window opening, you have the bottom plate. Here you can see me creating the header, which is made up of 2 2x6s with a piece of OSB in the middle, acting as a spacer and further reinforcing that header. I'll then nail it to what's called the king studs, as well as the top plate, and hammer in the jack stud. This jack stud supports the header and transfers that load to the bottom plate and then to the rest of the wall. For that reason, it's important that the jack stud is nice and tight. You don't want this to be loose. And just like that, we created what's called a rough opening for a window. All the measurements for the rough openings that you see in this video are available in the plan set. In the plan set though, I've also included a page that shows you how to size the rough opening for whatever window you come across. I also gave you a little tip on how to find cheap windows. Before attaching the sheathing, you then have to mark out where the hole is going to be. For that, I measured from the sides as well as the top of the wall where the rough opening started. Placing the sheathing down, I then did what's called a plunge cut. This allowed me to cut out the opening based on the measurements that I just took. To raise this wall, I needed the help of my brother. It was much too heavy for me to raise alone. And generally, I would say for all of the walls, don't raise it by yourself unless you're very comfortable with the process. Finally, I framed the door, very similar to how I framed the windows, and attached it to the rest of the walls. The door that we used in this project was very big. It was a custom size that we ordered. In the plan set itself, I've based it off of a much more common door that you'll be able to find quite easily. When I put up the sheathing here, I made sure that it wrapped around the corners. This made sure that the lateral strength was taken care of. Had I not wrapped around the corners, the whole thing would wobble. I then filled in the remaining gaps. For the corners, I framed them in a way that's called California corners. This allows for a stud to nail to once you get to the drywall stage, while still allowing for insulation to get into that corner. With the walls up, we're ready to move on to the roof. The first thing that we're going to create is what's called the master rafter, or at least that's what I call it. For this step, we're going to need what's called a speed square. First placing it against our rafter, we then rotate it until we reach the desired pitch that we're looking for. For these plans, that's a 6/12 pitch, so we line it up with the 6. We then make a mark and cut along that line. From there, we measure, based off the plans, the correct length of these rafters and make another mark along the same pitch. 90 degrees to the cut that we made, we're going to make another cut at the 3.5 inch mark. This allows a flat surface to rest on the wall with. We can then use that master rafter as a template to create 4 more rafters so that we can create the 2 outer trusses for our roof frame. To do this, we've put 2 rafters together and a scrap piece of wood that's mimicking our ridge beam. Placing another scrap piece of wood right up against the bottom of that ridge beam, we're going to screw that into place, and then we make sure that the bottom of the rafters will land right on top of the walls, which in our case is 8 feet apart. Once they're at that correct distance, we then screw another piece of wood to hold them in place. Then we take our ridge beam and we make marks every 16 inches, just like we have done previously. Taking our trusses, we can nail them to the walls so that they can stand freely. Once we've done that for both, we can simply drop in the ridge beam, and those scrap pieces of wood are going to hold it in place. This allows us to position it correctly so that we can then nail it. Okay, we still have that master, and we're going to use it to create a lot more rafters. With that template, you can really create a bit of a factory line here. With all the rafters cut, we can now install them in place. These should be 16 inches on center, meaning that they should land right on top of most of your studs. As you're nailing them into place, you might have to force them or give them a little muscle sometimes because they need to be at the same height. And the ridge beam might be a little bowed, one of the rafters might be a little off. It might take some fiddling with. Just make sure those rafters end right at the top of the ridge beam. Whoop. Whoop. Where'd he go? Who's that? You see 2 rafters really close to the edge because the inside one there is so that we can have a surface to nail the edge of the drywall to later. Okay, so now we're filling in the top of that wall segment. We can make this connection a lot stronger by carving out these notches. For the stud that's right below the ridge beam, I actually don't want this touching the ridge beam. That's because I want the weight from the roof to transfer into the rafters and then the walls. I don't want it transferring into that stud and then into the header right above the door. I'd rather it go into the outside walls. You'll also notice I had to carve out something for the door framing here. That's again because we had that very large custom door. You shouldn't have to do that. Okay, now we're sheathing the roof. So we framed it and we look up and we see this wonderful rib cage, but you might notice one thing. I made a bit of a mistake. As you can see, I used 2 nails to secure the rafters into the walls. Let's look at how the force is transferred. Weight from the roof comes down into the rafters and then has to change direction before it's being transferred into the wall. The nails are handling that transition of force, but we can further support that transition if our sheathing goes up to the top of the rafters. I didn't do that. So to further reinforce this connection, I did something a bit overkill and installed these L brackets.
But when you do this, you should use a single piece of sheathing that goes right up to the top of the rafters. I've corrected this in the plan set, so you shouldn't face the same mistake. Just something to be aware of.
We also need some sheathing to fill in the top of the walls. And as you can see, I messed that cut up. But as long as it starts and ends on a stud, it can be a bit of a jigsaw. That's fine. You can also use plywood if you run out of OSB like I did. Next, we're going to sheathe the roof. And just like with our walls, we're making sure that it starts and ends on a piece of framing. The same nailing pattern of 6 to 8 inches along the perimeter and around 8 inches on the inside is fine.
Before climbing up onto the roof, I made sure that the sheathing was nailed in multiple places and was secure enough to hold my weight. Then, as I climb up on the roof, I made sure that I always had one hand holding onto the framing. This was something that I'm comfortable with, but for a beginner, I would recommend using a ladder for this entire stage. Never do anything that you're not comfortable with. As we put that last piece of sheathing into place, we've now finished the framing.
That's a big accomplishment because now you've went from a conceptual design to something that you can actually walk into and get a feel for the space. It's a huge step. And now we're going to move on to the next one, which is to put on a base layer. What I mean by this is to think of your building the same way you think of putting on layers to go outside. Your base layer is your air barrier. This is what's going to keep your heat that you generate close to your body. After that, you have an insulative layer, and then you have a protective layer on the outside. We're going to get to those other 2 layers in a bit, but for now, we're focusing on the air barrier. We already got started on this with the walls. The Tyvek wrapping that we wrapped around the walls and taped together, that's part of the air barrier. But now we need to have that be continuous around the whole shell. The plywood sheathing that we just installed can actually act as an air barrier for our roof as long as we tape the seams. So we do just that. We're also going to tape that flap that we had at the top of the walls to that plywood sheathing. Make sure to leave a flap over the door for our next step, which is to seal the openings with our windows and doors. First thing we'll do is we're going to cut open that Tyvek that we placed over top of the window and door openings.
We'll then fold the bottom and the sides inside and staple them to the frame. For the top flap, we're going to leave that hanging because we want that to properly overlap our window later.
Around the bottom and the sides of these openings, we're going to put a weatherproof barrier. This ensures that any water that gets through the windows onto that sill doesn't slowly rot that sill over time. I used blueskin tape for this.
And you want to pay special attention to those bottom corners as you're making those cuts. I made just a small relief cut so that I could then stretch it into place. You don't want to cut too deep so that water could actually seep into that crack and then get into the framing. You want to make sure those corners are still well protected.
We do that for all our windows, as well as the door. The first thing for the door that we'll do is remove that bottom plate for the wall. That was there just so we could raise the wall, but we actually don't want it there when we install the door. We'll then put that flashing in the same spot. Because we're going to have a front overhang here that protects the door from rain, I'm not going to have that flashing tape go all the way up the sides. I could have done that if I wanted it to be completely overkill. I just didn't. Now we're ready to install the windows and doors. Right now is the perfect time to do it, when the air and water barriers are exposed so that you can connect the windows and the doors to them. The only thing is, for me, the windows and doors arrived much later than expected. There were delays in the shipping, and it forced me to install them much later into the build. When I did this, I still made sure that the air and water barriers were exposed so that I could connect to them. It just was a little harder. Either way, it's going to look very similar.
There are multiple types of windows and different ways to install each of them. I'm going to show you the way to install the window that I think you're most likely to come across, and that's one without a nail flange.
The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to build a frame for our windows. Measuring the height and width of the windows allows us to create a 3/4 inch pine frame to surround our windows.
As I drop it into place, I'm using wooden shims to elevate it slightly from that bottom surface of the outer frame, and that way it's not flush with the outer frame, meaning that there's a little bit of depth for me to then caulk later and seal the window to the frame. To secure the window to the frame, we're going to put screws in through the sides. The reason that we're going to put screws in through the sides and not the bottom is we don't want to create holes in the bottom and have water be able to reach the frame. Because I had to connect with the air and water barrier much later in the build, I had to double up on tape here to ensure continuity between that air and water barrier and the window frame. In the plan set, I have a helpful diagram for this step on how to install windows and doors. And I also have a page on how to modify the framing to change it so that it accommodates whatever window and door you come across. To help you find them, I've given you a tip on how to find cheap windows and doors. The window frame essentially floats inside the rough opening, being held in place by blocking and shims around the corners. It's at these locations that you install your screws to secure the window frame. Now with everything in place, I can continue that air and water barrier and connect it to the window frame. I'm doing this on the outside for the sides as well as the top, but I'm actually connecting it on the inside at the bottom. More on this later. As you can see, I've ensured that there is no way any air is getting through here, nor is any water. And for the top of the window, that flap that we left hanging was properly overlapped. That whole process should be a lot easier for you since you'll have your air and water barrier still exposed. The next thing that I did was I caulked the inside of the window to the window frame, ensuring an air seal. And this added to the caulking that I had on the outside. It was just a second layer of protection. For the gaps between the window frame and the framing, I filled that with spray foam insulation and then repeated all of these steps for the second window. Next up is the doors, which is essentially installed as if it's a big window. The first thing that I did was I placed a protective pressure-treated board at the bottom of the door. This is because in that space there was actually no siding and I needed things to be at the correct depth. I put an extra layer of that blue skin tape since this was much later in the build and that first layer had been stepped on a bunch. I was worried that it might be damaged. I then used the same trick with the tape to ensure connection to the garden room's air and water barrier. The
The screws that I used to attach the door frame to the overall structure were completed through the door hinges. As I'm installing these screws, I'm placing wooden shims behind them to make sure that the whole frame is level. That way the doors actually swing properly. That's it for the windows and doors. The main thing that I want you to think about for that step is the flow of water. As water comes down, we don't want it getting in above that cavity in the door or the window. And we also don't want it coming into the sides. So that's why we tape those sides and we ensure a proper overlap at the top. The reason that we actually tape the bottom on the inside is because in case any water does get into that window and flow down, we want it to be able to drain out towards the outside. Let's move on to the next step. Continuing our analogy of putting on multiple layers, we're now going to put on the sweater, which is the exterior insulation to the building. We're going to be putting this over top of that base layer that we just installed. Putting the exterior insulation into place, we're just going to put a few screws to hold it here. The reason being is the thing that's actually going to secure this insulation to the wall is the strapping. That is spaced every 16 inches on center because it has to attach directly to the studs on the inside. Make sure to not over tighten screws here, as you could compress that rigid insulation. This gives you a surface to nail the siding to later, as well as provides what's called a rain screen. So if water gets behind that siding, there's a gap here for the water to then drain down and out of the building. Because there's airflow behind that siding, it then allows it to dry completely from front to back whenever it gets wet. This prolongs the lifespan of your siding. Good job. You got part of your sweater on. The next thing that we'll build is the roof overhang. So there's a lot of creativity that you could do here. You don't have to use the exact same roof overhang that I did. Because we're installing it from the outside, this wasn't part of the framing that extended out, we can screw on whatever shape we want. I went with this angled one, but you can create any overhang you want. We've already created that closed, insulated, and airtight environment. Now we're just tacking on an overhang. I did this by first installing what I'll call an attachment board. I screwed this directly to the rafters and the studs so that it was supported by the rest of the frame. This gave me a surface to then attach whatever overhang I wanted to. I ended up creating what looks like an angled entrance. I wanted the feeling of entering a sort of den. I made it in two parts, but having the overhang just floating like that wasn't quite as strong as I wanted it to be. So I then created these angled support pieces that complete the look. The first time I built it, it ended up being a little too long, and that was a tough realization. I had to make it again from scratch. With those angled support pieces in place, the overhang was nice and strong. It could bear my weight. And with that, the overall shape of this garden room was completed, and we could then go back to the side yard and get a feel for what that entrance would feel like. We'd walk in from the side, turn the corner, and then all of a sudden be greeted by this giant open facade. The angled front further emphasizing that transition into the space. Now it's time for our roof portion of this sweater. Again, we're going to use minimal screws here. I placed another piece of sheathing on the front overhang just to make sure everything was at the same level. I also continued that tape job because might as well. With the insulation in place, I could screw on the second roof deck. I used long 4-inch screws here so that those screws were going directly into the rafters. It's this roof deck that we're going to attach the roofing underlayment as well as the roofing itself to later. So it's important that it's secured directly to the rafters. As I installed it, I made sure it was at the proper overhang. I created a jig to make sure that it was at the right distance from the strapping so that after I installed my siding as well as my fascia board, the drip edge could overlap. This will make more sense later. Same thing with the walls. As I'm tightening these screws, I'm making sure not to over tighten and compress the insulation. Now our building's got a sweater. The last thing that we're going to do is give it a raincoat. We have the base layer for holding in that trapped air. Then we have the sweater to further insulate that trapped air and make sure that that environment stays at the temperature we want it. And now we want to protect the whole thing. We're going to put a raincoat on. This is our siding as well as our roofing. Shout out to my dad for helping me with this step. For the roofing underlayment, secure it with plastic head nails based on whatever manufacturer's recommendations for your specific roofing underlayment. Also ensure proper overlap. I went with a vapor permeable roof membrane as well as a vapor permeable water barrier so that any vapor that built up inside the garden room would be able to escape. A vapor permeable enclosure allows it to dry more easily and make sure that moisture doesn't get trapped in the office, but it's not suited for every single climate. It works in Toronto where I built this, but you want to make sure that you're using a vapor barrier when appropriate based on your given climate. For a lot of places, given that you insulate properly, you actually don't need a vapor barrier. Now we're going to move on to the siding. I went with a product called LP Smart Side. This is available at most Home Depots and allows you to make a lot of progress really quickly with the siding since it comes in panels. I'm nailing it directly to the strapping. And because the strapping is screwed to the studs, this siding is supported by the structure of our garden room. For openings such as windows, I found it easiest to just install it, then cut that hole. With the last piece of siding up, we now have the shell to our building. But it's kind of like a picture without a picture frame. We want to make it look a lot nicer. And to do that, we need to install the fascia and the trim. The fascia is basically just the trim board that is running along the roof. Everything else we just refer to as trim. For both of these, we're going to prime a bunch of pine boards. This seals them from water and helps them last much, much longer. As we attach them to the frame, we can just use regular framing nails, and we can use what's called a nail puncher to help set that in without damaging the wood. For these fascia and trim boards, this is really where you want to take a lot of time. You want to get these joints really nice and tight together because you're going to see these in the finished form. And so you want to take some extra care here. At this stage, I like to cut these joints by hand. It allows me to slowly approach the final cut, taking away just a bit every time and making sure that the final joint is as tight as it can be. So now our garden room is looking very sleek because we've got this frame on it, but we can make it look even more sleek with a paint job. Before I painted, I used caulking along all of the seams between pieces of siding so that it looks like one continuous piece of siding once the paint job is done. To speed up this stage, I got a paint gun, and this made things go way faster. I was really impressed with it. You can, of course, just use a paint roller. I've done that for a lot of my past projects, but this really sped things up, both at this stage as well as the interior painting stage. Make sure to wear clothes that you don't care about, because you're definitely gonna get paint on it. Now our garden room is looking much more sleek. It's time for us to move on to roofing. The first step in that is installing our drip edge. And this is why I made sure that that roof deck was installed at the correct overhang. I'm making sure that the roofing underlayment is on top of the drip edge. That's the overlap that we want so that water can drain away. As I secured this metal roofing to the roof deck, I used screws that had an EPDM or rubber membrane on them. This allowed them to seal the hole that they created. I was also very mindful of where these screws were. I made sure that they were in a grid so that they were visually pleasant. With all the roofing installed, the last thing to do was put the roof trim on. I got this from a custom sheet metal shop. And of course, a roof cap to close it all off. To finish up the siding, I then went with a cedar front. I started with a board directly above the door and then expanded everything from there. As I installed boards, I made sure that they were 1/16 inch apart and kept that gap continuous so that they had some room to expand and contract, but also just for the look that I was going for. This angled part was really tough. I had to approach it over and over and over again. I didn't want it to be too tight where it started pushing that piece of trim out, but I also didn't want it to be loose because then you could see the gap. So it was a lot of trial and error getting it just perfect. Once it was where I liked it, I used brad nails to secure it in place. The cedar siding was complete, so I drilled holes for the exterior pot lights. Fortunately, that killed my drill. I then gave it a light sanding and used that paint gun to spray on a light stain. Earlier I mentioned that there would be Char's business logo on the side of the office. This is the stage where I did that. I put it on a scrap piece of cedar and secured it right to the side. With all that done, we've just completed the enclosure for our garden room. Now keep in mind, I designed this enclosure for Canadian winters and summers. It's very flexible, and so it's going to work in a lot of climates, but not every climate. If you're in a much warmer climate, you might need less insulation. If you're in a much colder climate, you might need more. But in general, this is going to work in a lot of North America. With the enclosure complete, It's now time for the part that you probably want to hire out for, and that's connecting the services. We're going to begin with electrical. I started off by working with Char to identify what's the interior layout going to be, and knowing that, where do we want the electrical outlets? Marking these, I then told my electrician where these outlets had to go, and he installed them. All of these outlets fed to a panel that was built into the wall of the garden room. To connect this panel to the main house required a trench. Where we are in Toronto, that trench had to be 18 inches deep in order to fit to code. At the point where that cable went into the office, I made sure to seal it with silicone. That cable then fed into that in-wall panel, which housed all the electrical equipment for the outlets as well as the mini split that we're going to connect in a second. For the mini split, I had to rush ahead and make sure that this section of wall was completed so that we could install the interior unit for the mini split. So I put up the insulation, then I put up the drywall, and then I had my HVAC technician install this mini split. This was a ductless mini split, meaning that the only connections that had to be made between the interior and exterior unit were refrigerant and electricity. The exterior unit sat on top of some legs so that when it snowed, the snow wouldn't block the airflow to that exterior unit. You can also see here the electrical disconnect that's needed to power this mini split. To make that exterior unit look a bit nicer, I created a cedar shell that could encapsulate this mini split without restricting the airflow. And that's the important part. As long as you don't restrict the airflow here, it's okay. With our surfaces installed, we can now fill in that skeleton that we've created with the frame with a bunch of pink fluffy stuff. And that is our insulation. Of course, you don't have to use fiberglass insulation like I did here. There's plenty of insulation that you could use. This is just most commonly available and does the job perfectly fine. As I'm installing it, I'm creating relief cuts for any time I come across a cable. The reason I'm doing this is you don't want to compress your insulation. It gets its insulative qualities from being able to expand. With all that insulation installed, we now can walk into our garden room and get the feel of what a inside of a stomach might look like or something. We're going to move away from that feeling by now making it livable with some drywall. So you notice that my electrician installed these metal plates for where those interior pot lights are going to go. Those are going to come in handy later. I got some help from my brother and my dad to install the drywall sheets for the ceiling. We were using 1/2-inch drywall because Char wanted some extra soundproofing. This meant that the drywall sheets were pretty heavy, and so the help was much appreciated. When you're cutting drywall, you don't actually have to cut all the way. You can make a relief cut about halfway through, and then from there you can actually just bend the drywall. It's important to install the ceiling drywall first so that the walls drywall is actually helping to hold up your ceiling's drywall. For a lot of wall pieces, you're gonna have to cut out holes for outlets. And to do this, you just transfer the measurements from where they are on the wall onto your drywall piece, cut them out, and then you're ready to install that section. This piece was especially difficult because it had 3 outlets that I had to measure for. But I nailed it. Now, as you're installing these drywall pieces, you need to make sure that it's 1/2 inch above the ground. I use a piece of plywood to help with this spacing. The reason that we want it slightly above the ground is because the walls are going to shift independently from the floor. And as it's doing that, we don't want that drywall directly in contact with the floor because then it could crack. So this 1/2 inch gap helps prevent cracking. Here you can see how I dealt with openings such as windows. To go around these corners, it's best to use a full sheet of drywall. It's just going to be a lot stronger and more resistant to cracks. Thanks to my buddy Reed for help at this stage. He was very useful. As you're screwing, you can follow the same screw pattern that you did for the sheathing. A screw every 6 to 8 inches is fine along the perimeter, and inside the drywall sheets, roughly 8 inches or so is fine. Now we can move on to mudding these joints. For this, our tools of choice are 2 spatulas. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to tape these joints. This will help give a surface for the mudding to actually hold on to for those gaps. We'll use our small spatula. I actually don't know what it's like properly called, but we're calling it a spatula. So we use our small one to glob on some of this mudding, and then our bigger one to smooth it. The first go at this that we're doing is just about filling those gaps. So you want to use a lot of mudding at this stage. For the corners, it's easier to do one side, let it dry, then do the other. It's okay to be rough here. We want to fill the cavities. For the next layer, that's when we focus on actually making it look presentable. Don't forget that for the screw holes, we need to cover those up as well.
So as you can see, the first coat can be really rough. This is just about filling the voids, and so if you have waves or little gaps or bumps, that's fine. Those are going to get filled in and smoothed out for the next coat. Next up, you're going to sand in between coats. Just a light sanding to get off any burrs or edges that you've created from that first coat. I like to use dust control mudding because it limits the amount of dust. Wow. It just results in a cleaner environment. For this second layer, I'm going to show you a bit of a technique. You want to make sure that there's no hard edges to your mudding. And so to do that, you're actually going to press down on one of the edges for your big spatula and then glide it along the joint that you're trying to smooth. This will make sure that it tapers off. You don't want it to be a hard end because that's going to show up later. Remember how my electrician had those metal plates earlier? That was there so that I could then take a Dremel bit and carve out the holes for the interior pot lights. Great, so now we're gonna paint the inside. The first thing that we're gonna do is we're going to cover up all the electrical outlets with some tape. I brought out the paint gun again for this step, and the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to put on a single coat of primer. This coat will help show any imperfections that you have from your second coat of mudding and is a good opportunity to now fill in those gaps. It should just be touch-ups here. It shouldn't be like a complete third coat. You can see here that I definitely needed these paint goggles from using the paint gun. I would definitely recommend these if you choose to use a paint gun. After 2 coats of primer, you're ready to move on to the actual interior paint itself. We used 2 different colors for the interior paint. One was an accent wall and the other one was some off-white. Now we're going to create a false beam. I say a false beam because this isn't actually structural, it's just for aesthetics. It's going to cover that gap that we have right at the top of our ceiling,
and also just give a really cool look to the inside of the office. I cut it in two so that I could actually install it. Installing it in one board I don't even think was possible. But I made sure that the connection between the two boards happened right at the light fixture so that it was kind of hidden. Now we need to finish the floor. And to do that, the first thing that we're going to do is lay out some flooring underlayment. This helps insulate the floor, it helps with comfort, and it actually also acts as our air barrier for the floor. Now, this air barrier isn't actually connected properly to the wall's air barrier, and this highlights a little gap in my construction. I could have gone through some extra taping from connecting that flooring underlayment to the wall's air barrier to make sure that you could draw a line along the whole perimeter of the enclosure and have a continuous air barrier the whole way. Where it is right now, there's a gap between the floor's air barrier and the wall's air barrier. They're not directly connected, and so air could seep in through that connection and come into the building. I'm actually okay with that, and that's why I didn't go overboard with this step right here, because we're going to be opening and closing windows and doors anyways. It's okay if a little air comes in. This didn't have to be some net zero garden room. You can if you'd like. I didn't. The kind of floor that I installed was called a floating floor, meaning that it's not actually nailed into place. The whole thing kind of just hovers in the room on top of that flooring underlayment. It all clicks together as long as you hammer it in place. And you want to make sure that you use a scrap piece to actually hammer it in place so that you don't damage the edges. There are many different kinds of floating floors. I like to use laminate flooring because it's waterproof, and I know people are going to be coming in and out of their yard into this space. For these boards, it's best to flip them upside down and cut them that way. It's going to have a much cleaner finished cut on the surface of your floor, which is the surface you actually care about. The floor pieces right along the wall are the hardest ones to do because you don't really have any way to hammer it from the other side. For these ones, just do the best you can. Okay guys, we're almost at the finish line here. The next thing that we're going to do is the interior trim. This really makes everything look a lot more finished. I recommend using what's called miter joints here, which are joints on a 45-degree angle. To make sure that you don't see a gap, put some caulking in that joint before you connect the pieces, and it'll just make sure that you don't see any void. I then painted that pine frame as well as the trim. Some more caulking between the trim and the wall makes this whole thing look very clean and uniform. I would use miter connections for the baseboard at the corners as well as between pieces, because again, it limits these voids that become kind of noticeable in the finished stage. For the exterior trim, the piece that you install at the bottom of your window, it's best to actually angle that outwards a little bit. That way, if any water hits it, it drains outwards. At the top, I put some additional metal flashing. This again is to have water drain away from our window. I put that same angle on the top piece. Like I said earlier, the windows came super late and they weren't even the right color. There was a lot of problems with this supplier. Regardless, I was able to paint them the color that we wanted. And I did that by first masking off the entire window and then using spray paint in 2 stages. First, I used a black primer and then I used a black finish coat. I then painted the trim as well as that protective sheath for the HVAC system, the same color as the siding. And just like that, you never would have noticed that the windows didn't come black. Okay, this is the final step. You're at the finish line. And this is just make it beautiful. It's the finishing touches, the small details that go a long way. One finishing touch I created here was a wooden step as well as some landscaping around the exterior of the garden room. On the inside, Shar did a wonderful job of moving into the space and having some really pleasant interior design.
Overall, this project turned out incredible. Thank you so much to Shar and her family for just being the best clients ever. They were so easy to work with, and we came up with a really exceptional design. I'm always going to remember this build, and I'm so happy that we're now opening its doors to the rest of the world.
Whoa, we're not done yet. Everything that you just saw represents how we've been building homes in North America for the past century. Our whole construction industry involved around it. And that's why you can find every single material in the material list at your local home improvement store. But as you can see, there's a lot of materials. I mean, for every single component of the building enclosure, we had a separate material. There was one for structure, one for the air barrier, one for the water barrier, 2 for insulation. What if we could reduce the amount of components it takes to build a home? Well, surely that would reduce the construction time significantly, right? And what if we could leverage robotics to pre-cut everything in a factory? Well, surely that would make construction a lot easier and reduce the costs as well. Well, that's what a small team and I are doing. We're about to embark on a journey where we're doing just that. And it would be really awesome if you wanted to be an early adopter or just get exclusive access to our first releases. And so if you want to do that, you can head to backyardarchitect.com/next to see what we're building. I'm really, really excited about it and hope that you join us on this journey. That was a long video. And you're still here? I mean, like, this is it though. I'm just gonna leave this link here. Am I in like another tab? Did you fall asleep? I hope you didn't. Fall asleep. Cool. Well, should head there. I'm gonna head over there. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.